In Chapter 11, we're going to be looking at the second part of our organic synthesis. In this section, we're specifically going to be looking at reactions that alter the carbon skeleton and how we can design multi-synthesis steps. First, we're going to just talk about some reaction information. First off, we want to talk about how we can look at a reverse synthetic process, meaning we're going to start with our target material and we are going to work backwards to determine our starting material. So this is what we refer to as a retrosynthetic step. This arrow that I have here is going to be our retrosynthetic arrow. It is an open arrow to denote that we're going to be looking at or starting with the target, the goal of our reaction synthesis, and we're going to work backwards to determine the starting material. So we're going to look at the reverse process. Our goal in any retrosynthetic process is to get to small molecules for our starting materials. We're going to do this by looking at different functional groups and how we can interconvert from one functional group to another. So we're going to be looking at these key features that we have been talking about in the last few chapters, and we're going to continue to build that repertoire of how we can convert from one functional group into another. What we do have to watch for in our retrosynthetic analyses is what we refer to as a synthetic trap. And this is when the reaction does not actually occur in the proposed or predicted process. This is usually due to other functional groups being present that we have not accounted for. So what we're going to have to look for with these is going to be a lot of our acid-base chemistry. Do we have other acidic protons that might react other than the one that we want to react? Do we have other bases present that might interrupt our reaction as well? Are there other functional groups that can behave as acids or behave as bases? So we're really looking at all the different functional groups present, and are they behaving the way that we want them to? Another synthetic trap that we have to watch for is going to be our regiochemistry and how it can impact a reaction. So this is where we have to remember about how primary, secondary, and tertiary things react differently and how they can impact different types of reactions as well. We're also going to have to look at some of our kinetic versus our thermodynamic controlled reactions. So will we produce the fastest product under the conditions that we have specified, or are we going to produce the most stable? So again, we're going to have to look at a variety of different things to make sure we don't get caught in a synthetic trap. So another thing that we have to watch for is going to be maximizing our percent yields when we're in the lab. And the way that we're going to maximize our percent yield is going to be by decreasing the number of synthetic steps that we have in each one of our processes, and by making sure we're maximizing the yield that we have for each one of those individual steps. So we have two ways that we can define or design our synthesis. One of them is going to be a linear synthesis. This is where the overall percent yield is going to be equal to the product of the yields for each one of our individual steps. So if I look at my starting material, and I'm going to go through a synthesis, and it'll be a multi-step synthesis to get to my final target. Each one of these reactions has a specific percent yield associated with it. So if I just go through and I alternate each one of my steps as having an 80 or a 90% yield, the way that I would calculate my overall percent yield is a product of all of those percentages. So we would multiply them all together, and my maximum percent yield that I could have for this overall linear synthesis would be a 47% yield. Another way that we can design our synthesis is through a convergent method. And this is where portions of the target are synthesized separately, and then they're finally brought together. So I would have my starting material for one process or one step, and I would go through a series of steps to get to a certain target. In a separate process, I would then have a different set of starting materials, and again, I would design a synthesis to get to a certain target. Those two targets would then be brought together to get to my final product I am looking for. Again, each one of these would have a percent yield, and I'm going to go ahead and use the same percent yields that I did previously to make our comparison a little bit easier. So 80 and 90, 80 and 90, and then a 90% yield at the end. Now, in order to calculate the overall base, it would be based off of the one step that limits the overall reaction. So since both of these are equivalent, I would only be multiplying the 80%, the 90%, and the 90%. So my maximum percent yield for this experiment would be a 58% yield. Even though it contains the same number of steps, by doing this convergent type synthesis, I have increased the maximum percent yield that we can have.